Hello everybody, today I'll show you how you can add a force feedback effect to your game. It will be a little hard to visualize the effect because you must feel it, but I put some strings, debug strings in the top left part so you can see which effect is playing. So as you can see, when I'm standing next to this explosion, I have the force feedback effect for the explosion. And I also have a force feedback effect when I jump and land. And I'll maybe add a video later of my controller moving on the desk when I stand next to the explosion, so you can see the effect is working. But let's start exploring how you can add these effects. And you can use this technique to add any other effect that you want, like a sound effect or particle effect, like this explosion, for example, or any other effect on some event, like the landing event for my character plays this force feedback landed effect. And also I'll show you how to adjust the strength of the effect based on the distance between you and the force feedback event, like this explosion, for example. If I stand next to the explosion, the force feedback is very strong, but if I'm away from the explosion, the effect is a little bit less noticeable. So let's start by seeing how we can create force feedback effect, how we can apply this attenuation to reduce the strength of the effect based on the distance, and also how to use them on events, how to use force feedback effect that's constantly running, and how to switch it on and off. For example, I can make it so that when you're on top of this bridge, the effect is being applied constantly, so you feel like the bridge is shaking, for example, or something like this. So let's start first by creating the jumping effect. Let's delete everything I have for the force feedback, and I'll start with a new setup for everything. So as you can see, I cleared everything. Now, okay, no message now and no force feedback now. So let's go back to my force feedback folder and let's add a force feedback effect. So right click in your content browser, type force, and you have two options, force feedback effect and force feedback attenuation. Let's start with the bottom one. So the force feedback effect that we'll create will be for the landing. So let's call it force feedback landing. And if you hover over this icon, you see a play icon on top of your force feedback effect. If you click this icon, it will play the effect on your controller, so you will feel the force feedback, so you can test it that way, if your setup is good or not. So let's open this force feedback effect, and let's see now what you can change inside here. So you have 4 checkboxes, and these checkboxes will affect which of the controller motors inside will work to contribute to this force feedback effect. You can check all of them or just one of them or any combination, but let's start, for example, with all of them. And you have this area to draw the curve that you want, so you can control the strength of the force feedback effect on the time scale. So the horizontal line is the time and the vertical is the strength. The strength is controlled from 0 to 1. 0 means no vibration and 1 is the full amount of vibration that your controller is able to produce. So let's start with the 0 point. So shift clicking anywhere on this graph will add the point. So let's select the first point, and you have 2 values for each of the point. The first one is the time and the second one is the value. So I'll start with the time 0 and the value 0. So we'll start with no effect in the beginning. Then as we pass, for example, 0.01 seconds. So this is a hundredth of a second. We will go to the value of 0.6. Don't go to the full value of 1 unless it's a very, very strong effect, like for example the explosion we will do. Stick with the lower values because the full amount is a very strong force feedback. So let's continue with the next point. Let's do a 0.05, and the value will be again 0.6. Then let's go to 0.1 and do a value of 0.3, then 0.4 and the value of 0. And I don't need these endpoints, I'll delete them with the delete key. So now I have this effect which is very strong in the beginning, and then it's gradually reducing for a 0.4 of a second. And this is a good start for the effect. It will affect all of the motors, as you can see, the large ones and the small ones. So let's test it with hitting the play button. I don't know if you can hear it vibrating on the desk. I'll try put it next to the microphone. I'm not sure if you hear that, but it's vibrating and it feels okay for me, like a landing. So let's start with this. And for example, if you want to have some different feel, you can uncheck, for example, these small motors and add additional curve by clicking this plus sign here at the top. So now I have two curves. You can see I have two indexes here, two elements. The first one is the one we already created, and the second one is a new one. So I'll unselect the large motors and I'll do a different curve for the small motors. So I'll start again from 0, then I'll go to the 0.01 and do a 0.5 value, then 0.4 and I'll do 0.1 value. And the force feedback effect will take all of the curves that you have and it will see the last time element. So for example, now they're both matching at 0.4, and this will be the end of my force feedback effect. If I have, for example, this lower one continue to 1 second, this means that the full effect will be 1 second long. So the last keyframe that you have, this will be the end of your effect. So let's leave it that way. So this means that the first 0.4 seconds I'll have the large motors running and they will decrease gradually to a value of 0. And then for the rest of the time I'll only have the small motors running. So let's save this and try it again by hitting this play button. So I can feel now the longer forced feedback effect, and it feels very long for a landing. So let's reduce the time for these small motors to 0.5, and this will be fine. So half a second. And one of the drawbacks in using this editor right here is that, first of all, you cannot reuse your curves. So if I want to have this same effect used somewhere else, I need to draw this curve again. And also, I do not have very good control over how I'm placing the points. I usually manually write the values in the fields right here. But there's a different way in using the forced feedback effects, and this is by attaching an external curve. So let's create another curve here. So right click, type curve, and create a curve asset right here. So I'll call it, first you need to select the type. The type will be a float value. Let's select it and I'll call it C landing, or use some more generic name like instant force feedback or something like this to indicate that it's only happening for a short amount of time. So let's open this curve and you can see we have a similar editor here. Here, if you shift click, you don't add points. So there's different controls for this window, but I'll show you what benefits that this window has. So for example, you add the points either by right-clicking and selecting Add Key, or by hitting the Enter key, which is, as you can see here, the hotkey for this Add Key command. So let's hit the Enter key. No matter that my mouse wasn't there, the point is snapped to this place. This is because I have snapping enabled, and this is one of the many benefits of this custom curve window. You no longer have to drag the values and enter them manually. You can snap them easily. So if I click enter again, and if I try to move these points now, you can see that they're snapping both for the time and for the value. So here are the two values right here. So the 0.4 value, I want to have my value as 0, and for 0.1, I want to have my value go to 0.8, for example. I have it at 0.6, I believe. So something like this was my curve before. Or it was even not on the 0.1, but 0.01. So how you can change this? You can change the time snapping to have a different interval. So currently it's 10 frames per second. So each second is divided into 10 parts. And if I want it as 100 parts like I had it set up before, I'll change this to 10 milliseconds. And I can now snap this better. Let's change this to 10 millisecond. And now I can snap this to 0.01 like I had it before. I had it at 0.05 maybe, with a value of 0.3 or something like this. I don't remember exactly, but you can see that here you can control the snapping both for the time and for the value. So currently the values are snapped by 0.1, but you can change the snapping for them at any other interval or write a custom one. So the automatic is usually fine for 0.1 snapping. And by saving this curve, I can go back to my force feedback like this. Oh, I had another key of a 0.05, so the 0.05 one was right here with the same value, and then another key here with some lower value. So something like this was my curve. So let's save it again. Let's go back here. And now, instead of using these values, let me delete it. I can select the curve that I created. So C_landing is the curve that I created. And you can see it loaded the curve that I made here into this panel. And I can reuse this curve on any other panel. So for example, here at the bottom, instead of drawing this curve, I can just select it like before. So C_landing, I can use the same curve at both places without drawing it twice. If I'm doing the same curve, it doesn't really make sense to have two different values. So let's remove this second one. Let's delete it, and let's enable the small motors here. Just wanted to show you how all the settings here work and what they do, and why it's good to have this custom curve created into the different panel for the curve creation, and how you can reuse this curve at multiple effects. So let's save this, and let's now go into our level. And what I want is to have my character, after he jumps, when he lands, to apply this force feedback effect. So let's go into our character blueprint, and the character blueprint has an on-landed effect. So right click in your event graph, type on landed, and this will create this on landed effect node, and you can connect the force feedback effect to this. But in order to play the force feedback effect for your character, you need to do it on the controller. So right click and get the player controller. So this function here, get player controller, into the game section. Make sure you select this one. And this player controller now has the client play force feedback function right here. So this client play force feedback effect will play the effect that we just created. So you can select the effect here from the drop down, and we want the landing effect here. So let's compile and save this. And this force feedback effect will be played when we call this event. And to be easier to see on our screen, I'll just print a string as well. So let's print play force feedback landing. And when you see this string, this means that I feel this force feedback on the controller. So let's compile and save this and go into the level, and let's start jumping. And when you land, you can see the force feedback is being applied. And I'll try again to move the controller next to the microphone. Hopefully you hear that, or if I hear after this on the editing the sound, if it sounds very bad, I'll remove the sound, but every time you see this play FF landing message at the top, this means that the landing effect is being applied to the controller. And let's now see what the other effect that we had here as an option when right-clicking and doing a force feedback effect does. So we have this force feedback attenuation here, and this is basically a setting of how the effect will fall off based on the distance from the effect. For example, the explosion that I had before, I want to have the force feedback effect very strong at the location where the explosion is being applied, but I want to gradually reduce the furthest away I am from this effect. So let's create another force feedback effect for the explosion, and I'll call it force feedback explosion. And let's set up the curve, for example, like this. I want to have the value at 0 to be starting at 0, and I want to have it like very high value in the beginning and then quickly coming down. And I'll do this for the big motors, and for the small motors I'll add another element, and I'll add, for example, something like this, where I have 2 spikes. And the last point here is at 0.1, let's say, and here it will be 0.1 as well. So for 0.1 of a second, I'll have 2 spikes for my small motors and 1 very big spike for my big motors. Let's test this here. I'll hit play. It's very, very short. Maybe this was better for the landing, but for the explosion, I want to have a bigger effect. So let me add some values here. I'll do it like 0.4 again. And here I'll do it 0.1, something like this. So this is the curve that I want. And here again, I'll do 0.4. And I'll do it like this. Or even let's do it 0.6. So I have longer, but a little bit less noticeable small motors effect here. So let's save this and let's test this into our content browser here. Okay, this feels a little bit better. So let's now create another way to trigger our effects. So they will be placed in a blueprint into our level. So let me right click and create a blueprint class. This will be an actor, so I can place it in the level, and I'll call it BP explosion. So for this actor, I'll create two components. One of them will be Niagara particle system component, and the other one will be force feedback component. And for the force feedback component, let me parent both to the default scene root. So they're both here at the center of my blueprint. So the Niagara effect will be this explosion, this simple explosion. And the force feedback effect will be my explosion force feedback. So let's compile and save this. And now let's disable the whooping of my force feedback effect. And let's disable this auto activate. And for the Niagara, let's also disable this auto activate effect. So let's compile and save this. And here the force feedback effect has this attenuation settings field at the bottom of inside this details panel. And this is where we can connect this other type of node that we can create here. So right click, do a force feedback attenuation, and I'll call it force feedback attenuation explosion. And into my blueprint, I can connect this attenuation into the force feedback component. So let's connect it here, and it will create two spheres inside the component. The small one is the area that this effect will be felt at full strength. So let's open the force feedback attenuation settings, and you can see that we have an inner radius and we have a fall off distance. So the inner radius currently is 4 meters. So let's do a radius, for example, of 100 units. So this is 1 meter radius, and the fall off distance will be, for example, 10 meters. So 1000 units. So if I save this and place this blueprint into my level, you can see that 10 meters away from the center, this big sphere is showing me that I cannot feel the effect further away from this sphere. So I need to be inside this sphere, and the effect will gradually reduce from the small sphere to the bigger sphere. Currently, because I deactivated the auto enabling of this effect, I need to have some way of controlling when the effect is playing and when the effect is stopped. So I wanted to show you how you can control the force feedback effects. That's why I disabled the auto activation. And I want to go back into my blueprint, and I want to add another component, and this will be a box. So this box collision effect, I'll have this box collision again parented under the scene root here, and I'll have the box extends as some bigger value in order to take up the whole bigger sphere. So for example, I'll do 1000, 1000 and 500, something like this. So if I compile and save this, you can go into the level and you can see that this box is roughly fitted inside this attenuation sphere. So if I go inside this box, let's scroll down here at the details panel. I want to have this on component being overlap event. So let's click on the plus sign here. So when I overlap this box, I'll check if this other actor is the same. So let's check this equal operator. So let's check if the other actor which this box is colliding with is the player character actor. So get player character. Let's compare it to this. So if my player character enters this box, let's add a branch node here, and the condition will be this comparison. So if my player character is the other actor in this box, in that case, I want to set a timer by event. So this timer by event, you can set how much time will be between each of these events. So let's say we'll add 5 seconds. We'll check this looping. So this means that the effect will repeat itself. And this event will create by dragging here from the event. We'll add event and add a custom event, and we'll call it explosion. So when we call this explosion event, we want to play the force feedback. So drag out of this explosion, type play, and choose the force feedback play, or control drag this force feedback here and select the play option. Let's drag this execution pin, and then also control drag the Niagara effect. So activate the Niagara effect on this explosion event. So when the explosion event is called, we'll activate the explosion, we'll play the force feedback, and let's print a string. And this string will be play force feedback explosion. So this will show you when the force feedback is being played. So this force feedback, as you can see here, plays the explosion effect with this attenuation settings. So let's go into the level, let's hit play, and let's go inside this box. So I'm now in the box, so 5 seconds after I entered, the explosion will play, and you will see at the top left corner that the force feedback effect is being applied. And because I'm next to the explosion, the force feedback can be felt with full strength. And if I go far away from this force feedback, there's less and less strength to the effect. So here it's barely noticeable. And if I go back here, I don't feel at all the effect of the force feedback because I'm outside the sphere of this attenuation. If I go back in here, when the explosion happens again, the force feedback again is being noticed. So this is a way that you can control the strength of the force feedback based on where the effect is placed in the level. And if I want to stop this timer, so this explosion to stop happening when I'm outside of this volume, this box collision volume, let's go back here into our blueprint. Let's create a variable which we'll call a timer handle, and the type will be timer handle. This means that this will be referencing the timer that we connect here to this handle. This timer handle variable is connected to this timer event, and after we exit this box component, so go to the boxed component and scroll down to the events and click on the on component and overlap plus sign. And here we can use this timer handle to clear the interval and timer by handle. So this will clear the interval and we will stop this effect in our level. So you can control this way with the box collision and entering and exiting this collision the effects that you want to apply by saving the timer handle and clearing it out when you go outside of the volume. So if I go outside of the volume right now, you can see the explosion stopped and I no longer have the debug text at the top that the force feedback is being played. And right now, when I'm inside, it's again happening. So this, every time you go out and go in, it will start and stop this explosion effect. But the effect of landing, it's called every time that your character lands. So these are two ways that you can call this effect. And the last effect that I wanted to show you is how you can make the effect constantly being applied. So let's go back into our blueprint, and instead of this explosion, let's do another thing. Let's disconnect everything right here, or actually let's disconnect everything after this branch. So we'll again check if our character is the one that's overlapping this box. But after we check this, we'll again get the player controller. We'll again play the force feedback by quant place force feedback function. And this time we'll play, for example, the landing, or let's create a new one. For example, I'll create a force feedback effect and I'll call it force feedback bridge. Let's save this. Let's open this effect. Let's add the curve and I'll do something like this with a very low strength, for example, 0.2, 0.3, something like this, but a longer effect. And I'll add different curves for the left motors and for the right motors. So I'll add another curve right here. And I'll do it like this, but only for the right motors. So you can feel different vibration in the left and the right motors. And this will make it feel like it's a little bit unstable, something like this. Or at least that's the idea. So let's go back here and let's go back into our blueprint. So we'll play the effect of the bridge, force feedback bridge, and this time we'll check this whooping option. And this means that this effect will be played from start to the end constantly. And we want to stop it after we go out of this box. So let's disconnect this timer that we had. And now let's get the player controller and let's stop force feedback effect. So client stop force feedback, and the force feedback that will stop is this bridge effect. Let's compile and save this. And right now, let me scale this box a little bit. I don't really need this force feedback effect right now. It was connected to the explosion effect, so I'll delete them. I'll delete everything right here as well. So you can see like this, you can set up a force feedback effect, which is connected here, and it can be played constantly when you enter this box. So I'll scale the box to match the bridge or something like this. And if I go inside this box, right here, I can feel the force feedback effect being applied when I stand on the bridge. So I can go out and the effect stopped. I can go back in, and now the effect is being played again. Okay, So one other thing that I wanted to show you is if you don't want every time that you go into this blueprint to play the same effect, you can create a variable. Let's call it force feedback effect. I'll change this to a force feedback effect reference. I'll make it public. I'll save this and I'll connect this to the force feedback effect fields of the both play and stop functions like this. And right now, when I'm inside the editor and I select this blueprint, you can see I have this force feedback effect field here, and I can connect the bridge force feedback, for example, right here. And if I go here inside the box, the bridge effect is being played constantly, but I can connect on other effect and I can feel the other force feedback effect right now. So this way you can reuse this blueprint at multiple parts of your level and play different effects. So here at the left one I can have the bridge, and on this one I can have the explosion or something like this. The bridge will be here better for the actual bridge, and here I can connect the explosion or something like this. So you can reuse the same component, scale the box the way that you want, so the effect can be contained into the space that it makes sense in your game, and you can choose the effect by setting this variable. I think that these ways will clearly help you to control which effects and where in your level are being played and how. You can do the same with sound effects or particle effects or something like this, but I wanted to show how to add a force feedback effect because it really adds a lot to the experience. You can combine it with other effects, so for example the explosion can be the particle effect, the sound effect, because you need that for explosion, and also the vibration effect. So combining all of the effects will make it realistic, and this will make your game stand out a lot more than if you don't have some of these effects applied. So guys, please, if you have some comments or questions, write in the comments. You can like the video and subscribe to the channel, this will help me a lot. And if you want to support me to continue to create these videos, you can join the channel, and if you join the higher levels you have access to the videos earlier, so you can ask your questions there before everyone else. And guys, thank you and see you in the next one. Bye.